Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tempest Debates video lecture series. Today we'll be talking about Crossfire and Crossfire strategies. So basically, what is Crossfire? Crossfire is a 3-minute time allocated in a debate round for opponents to ask each other questions. It can be clarifying questions, questions that highlight flaws in arguments, or questions that really set up a strategy later on in the round. So essentially, there are 3 different crossfires. The first crossfire is right after constructive, and it is the 2 first speakers doing a 3-minute crossfire. And then after rebuttals, the second speakers do their crossfire. And after summaries, there is a grand crossfire where everyone speaks. So some general do's is you want to highlight flaws in your opponent's arguments and call out contradictions, but you don't want to be disrespectful and rude. And you also want to be assertive, but not aggressive. And it's really hard, like the lines really blur around those. So you really just want to, take a step back and just assess if you're being assertive or aggressive. So some general advice for Crossfire. First, ask leading questions. What this looks like is ask questions that assumes an answer. So for example, you can be like, we're in a recession, correct? But obviously you wouldn't ask that if you didn't have a strategy for why you asked it. Because a leading question doesn't mean anything unless there's a reason why you asked it. And then the second advice is if your opponents ask you a question, answer it in number form. What that means is if they ask you a question, you can be like, no, that's not true for 2 reasons. The first, blah, blah, blah. The second, blah, blah, blah. That is really important because usually, I'm going to be real, that Crossfire with a tech and a flow judge, it doesn't go into, they don't vote off of Crossfire. But if you have a parent judge or a judge who is generally new to the debate atmosphere and environment, they do place a hefty weight on crossfires. And that's really important because if you answer in number form, it makes it look like you know what you're talking about and that you're answering in a really professional way. And the third advice is sound confident and don't back down. Even if you feel like you're getting pushed into a corner, don't contradict yourself. Hold your first point, and if you said something wrong, clarify it. Sound confident even if what you're saying isn't 100% accurate. It's better to sound like you know what you're talking about when you don't than not know what you're talking about and sound like you don't know what you're talking about. The fourth piece of advice I would give is that mention evidence names when you're responding to questions, but don't read the evidence. So for example, you don't want to tell your opponents, I have a card, and then just scroll through your computer trying to find that card for 2 minutes. No, that's a waste of time. You should know your evidence well enough to where if your opponents ask you a question, you can be like, oh, our Johnson evidence tells you this. And that's great because A, now the judge has that piece of evidence in their mind, but B, you sound like you know what your argument is because you can cite an author that supports your argument. And then the fifth advice I would have is don't ask, is it true questions? Because these really just back you in a corner. Because obviously I'm going to assume that because you're asking that question, the answer is obviously, yes, it is true. And that is not the most effective way to get your point across. But the sixth piece of advice is that I would ask for warrants. This essentially means asking why something happens. So if your opponents run an argument, you want to ask so why does XYZ happen? For example, on the Medicare for All topic, if someone runs that Medicare for All leads to a decrease in innovation in developing worlds, or decrease in drug access in developing worlds, you can be like, so why does giving coverage to Americans ultimately lead to a decrease in innovation abroad? It forces them to explain their link chain. And if they explain it in a way that doesn't really make sense, you can point out their contradictions. But then 7, I would contest the link chains. So how does A lead to B and B lead to C? So in a lot of debate cases, what you'll find is that they start with A, but suddenly it jumps to Z. And it's like, what are the steps in between? Like, for example, on the Medicare for All topic, people say that um, passing Medicare for All is a golden ticket for Trump to win, which leads to basically end of like humanity because they won't be able to solve for climate change. So you can be like, why would having a single explain how having a single payer healthcare system leads to human extinction because of climate change? Like that doesn't really make sense, and you want to point that out. The 8th piece of advice is you want to contest and argue the impact. So question if their link is the only link that causes the impact. For example, the climate change example, is passing Medicare for All the only thing that's worsening climate change? Obviously, the answer is no. And if they say no, then you can easily argue, okay, well, your impact, your link chain is completely non-unique because even without Medicare for All, the climate's going to get inherently worse, and global warming is going to lead to extinction in the long term without it. And I would also give a slight warning that Crossfire is not a time to give another 1-minute speech. You're trying to ask questions back and forth. So you don't want your answer to be so long. And you also don't want to ask like 5 questions in a row. Like you're supposed to be bouncing off your opponents, and each person, ask questions to each other. And generally, the person who speaks first, aka the team that speaks first, usually gets the first question. That's just a courtesy. And then the 9, I would say, use Crossfire to set your opponents up for later speeches. You should know, you should have an idea of what your partner is going to say, either in summary or rebuttal. So you want to set up an argument so they can later on expand on it. And then 10, I would say, really be civil. Crossfire can definitely get heated, but you don't want to lose your cool and start screaming at your opponents. Like that doesn't look good for anyone. Okay, so we're not going to do a drill together today, but some general drill ideas that you can do to improve your crossfires is get someone to read a case. Then think of questions of the case. Ask a link question, ask a warrant question, ask an impact question. Just keep going through that. If you're a second speaker, get someone to read a rebuttal, ask questions to that. Generally, I would say that if you don't have a case you can read, you can always go back to our old presentations. I know in the PF flowing drill, we read a case, and you can use that for this drill idea. Or you can reach out to us via email, and we can send you a case to read. Thank you, and for tuning in, and I hope everyone is having a great day.